edition for 2025. We are also very excited and grateful to welcome Dina Smeltz again. She is the Vice President of Public Opinion and Foreign Policy at the Chicago Council. She oversees the annual survey of American attitudes toward foreign policy published by the Council and publishes a range of commentary and analysis on foreign affairs and in various publications. Her experience spans over 25 years, including designing and fielding international social and public opinion and political surveys. She has extensive experience in the Middle East, South Asia, and Europe. She has also researched post-war attitudes in Bosnia, Kosovo, Cyprus and Palestinian territories, as well as Iraq. So thank you for joining us. We're very excited to have you here. James Kim is the Director of Public Opinion and External Relations here at KAI. He also lectures in public policy at Columbia University and has previously been the Senior Research Fellow and Director of the Center for Regional Studies and the Center for Public Opinion Research at the Asan Institute in Seoul. This year, James has released other survey reports, which I also think tie into today's conversation, both about public opinion in the US towards investments in the US, and a even more recent survey on the trilateral cooperation between the US, South Korea, and Japan. So those two survey studies are already available on the KAI website, and this one will shortly join those two publications as well. So James, thank you for those works, and we are very excited to hear more about your findings in the most recent survey today. So with that, I'm going to let you first present some of your findings before asking Dina to follow up and share some of her insights. And then we're going to have a conversation following that, and finally open up for questions, both here in the room and for viewers online. So thank you.
Thanks, Niels. That was a very generous introduction, given that you've taken part in two of those, or if not one of those projects. And actually two. No, but that was a different report. That was on tariffs. And then the public opinion survey, which was an experimental survey. And Dina, even though it sounds like she's just, slipping in here as a designated hitter for this event, she's actually taken part and actually consulted us and advised us on the questionnaire design for the trilateral survey. She's been a very good collaborator to have. We're very lucky that we have this amount of experience feeding into our annual survey. And so you guys are co-conspirators in this. You shouldn't be left out of this discussion. But for this year's annual survey, which is a follow-up to last year's survey, it was a little different. If you take a look at last year's report on the appendix for the questionnaire and this year's report appendix for the questionnaire, you'll find that some of the questions have been switched out and new questions have been introduced. And it was largely because it wasn't clear to us last year after doing the first report at about, in fact, we released it in October of last year, second week of October, I think. It wasn't clear to us that it was really adding anything new to the insights that we already had in the previous 4 years before that. And so we decided to switch it up a bit, and so there are some new questions. We may end up keeping some of this, or we may decide to not have this in our next year's survey, but it's something worthwhile looking at. So looking at the top line, there are three broad trends that I think are worth mentioning here. First, there's continuing support for existing alliance relationships and trade relations that the US has had. So on this issue, I think public opinion is somewhat of a lagging indicator compared to what's happening in Washington. So where we've seen a lot of changes happen over the last nine months or so, but the American public largely doesn't seem to see that from their point of view, even though they're reading about it in the news. They're still supporting the same allies, whether it be Europeans or East Asian allies or elsewhere around the world. They still want to have open trade with these countries that they've continued to have in the past. But this is where the second part comes in. The American public also, if you take a look at how they see different countries around the world, whether it be how they characterize them as, whether they're partners or adversaries, that I think is becoming, there's some signs that there's transition happening on some of those attitudes. And so it's not surprising, but it's now beginning to show up in the data set. And you could only see this if you look at it longitudinally over time. So we have 6 years worth of data that we utilize to be able to see that trend. The third thing that I think is very important is that even though these transitions happening and old relationships still important, what country it is that the U.S. is having relations with and what kind of relationship that is actually very, very important. So whether it's trade with China as opposed to trade with Japan, for instance, or alliance with Korea as opposed to alliance with Europe, there are marked differences in how the Americans see this, and in fact, there are marked differences in partisan alignment associated with some of these issues. So we'll go into that a little bit, and I'll just quickly run through these charts for you. And the first thing that we can take a look at here is a cross-longitudinal view of this whether Americans see certain countries as being influential or non-influential. And in some instances, you're not seeing many differences here, right? So you look at the very top. Most Americans tend to think that United States is the most influential country, then followed, by China, somewhat more distant, but still, and a meaningful differentiation there between China and the rest of the countries. And here on the left, you have very influential ratings, and then the second on the right, second set of charts, you have fairly influential, grouped into different regional, into different regions. And if you were to aggregate this data and take a look at this at the rank order from 1 to 14, certain ranks don't change. And this is just, you might say that from a statistical standpoint, we have our margin of error is 3.34 for this year. And it's hovering around 2.5 to 3.5 on any given year you're looking at these, in each year, there are different margins of error. So you might say that the statistical differences don't mean anything, but it's interesting to see that there are consistencies in the rank ordering of these countries over time. Where you do see some change, you see it right in the middle there with European Union and Canada in between. And that may have to do with the events that are happening around those times. And then there's South Korea right there around 8th or 9th. But I would group probably anywhere between European Union and South Korea, second group, or European Union might even be bumped up to the top group. So US down to Europe, and then because that's about a 10 percentage point difference. And then from European Union down to South Korea, another 10 percentage point difference. And then the rest, right? So it's just interesting that this grouping has been consistent over time. Again, continuity that we're seeing. In terms of looking at critical foreign policy challenges, we took we had a question that asked people to choose number 1, number 2, number 3 critical foreign policy challenges. What's interesting in this trend is that China's people's perception, Americans' perception of China as a critical foreign policy challenge has been ticking down a bit, but for Russia, it's been ticking up. And I think that has largely to do with the length of time that Russia's been involved in, Ukraine crisis has continued. The longer that crisis goes, it becomes, recognized by, by folks as a potential problem that you eventually are going to need to deal with. So I think that this is kind of interesting that in two countries, Russia and Israel, the relative importance they're putting these countries in terms of critical foreign policy challenge has gone up, while China's sort of rating has gone down. That's not to say that China is still unimportant. It's still up there. So in terms of great power competition and how we think about the strategic competition in Indo-Pacific, I think that, I don't know why that went off, but it hasn't really changed just yet. So we haven't seen the golden cross there. In terms of threats, and I know I took this from Chicago Council, so this question is kind of very similar to Chicago Council's question. In fact, it's a carbon copy. But the countries are different a bit, I think. Our set of countries might be a bit different than what Chicago Council had. And we try to take a look at to see whether or not the critical threat to U.S. national security interests and how people prioritize this are different. And what we find is, interestingly enough, Russia is considered to be the most critical threat, followed by China when it comes to these threats. And then, North Korea and Iran sort of ranks lower. You see the darker circles there, that shows how these countries are being perceived. What's also interesting here is that some of these, some of these countries that you normally don't consider threats sometimes register among some people. And I think this gets at the sort of, this point that I wanted to make next about this change that is happening. Even though you're seeing continuity, there are some changes also that seems fairly evident. And here I'm taking a look at snapshots of 2020 and comparing that to this year's survey. And what we're looking at is how Americans categorize these countries as either partners or adversaries. And red dot means adversary, and blue dot means partners. And the difference indicates, how many more respondents have answered one way or the other. Color of the difference corresponds to the color of the higher number. And what's interesting here is that the gaps and how people think about these countries as either a partner or adversary is narrowing in 2025 as opposed to in 2020. It's fairly clear. There's no doubt in anybody's mind about who's an adversary and who's a partner. But in 2025, all of a sudden, this is narrowing. What that seems to suggest to me is that how Americans think about these countries also changing. Now, does this mean that it's going to change completely? Well, no, not necessarily. It's in the process of undergoing this change. And in almost every single country, what you're seeing is that difference or the gap is actually getting smaller in 2025 as opposed to 2020. There's no exception to this. All right, so that's the macro trend. So what about Korea? How does Korea match up to the macro trend? And so I want to get to the last figure that I had in the report and bring that up forward in the front. And here the question really is when it comes to Korea policy, what do Americans think about what the Trump administration is doing and how it's performing here? Because this survey was taken right after Labor Day up until September 12th. And what we're seeing here, over the 6-year period that we've taken the data on this question, we have a record low at 33% in terms of approval. So what that means is that I think what this suggests is that not many people are, many more Americans are not approving. Doesn't mean necessarily more Americans disapproving, because we've had record disapproval rate in 2020. We're getting there, but we're not quite there yet. And it's still, statistically different today than it was then. But you take a look at the not sure. A lot of people are not sure. That's where the big markup is, right? That's an 8 percentage point increase. People are just not sure exactly what's going on here. Okay, but clearly the people are not approving what's going on. Okay, so So this is quite interesting, and it's rightly so, because when you take a look at how Americans think about South Korea and relations with South Korea, basically across the board, there has not been any change over the last 6 years. I don't see any meaningful change, right? Consistently favorable for South Korea, 66%, that's 2/3 of Americans. Consistent understanding about the benefits of trade with South Korea. Consistent understanding that the U.S. military alliance with South Korea is in U.S. national interest. There's absolutely zero question about this, no big change here. Even on troop levels in South Korea, more than half, would support maintaining the current troop level. And even in the case where you have North Korea that denuclearizes, we're nearly half. So it seems to me that the support for USFK is very high. There hasn't been many meaningful changes on any of these fronts. And why is this the case? When you take a look, most Americans, and this is like 76% of Americans, understand that this either benefits both the US and our allies, or it mostly benefits the United States. Okay, so this is, and here, while that is the case, you take a look at how this is, I believe this is Republicans and Democrats, how different parties think about these issues. There are differences, right? In terms of whether or not we ought to be maintaining, this is just generally thinking all security alliances around the world. Republicans tend to be less supportive about maintaining these alliances than the Democrats, as you can see on the top half. But the Republicans want some kind of reform or change to the existing relationships, more so than the Democrats, right? In terms of ending all alliances, that's the least favored item. Now, Republicans also more willing to consider reforming some and ending some alliances as well, more so than the Democrats. Not surprising, right? In terms of whether or not this mostly benefits the United States or it benefits our allies, Republicans overwhelmingly think that it benefits more our allies. Democrats overwhelmingly think that it mostly benefits the US. But even though, you look, both parties, I think there's a general consensus, majority or supermajority on both sides think that it benefits both. Okay, so it's not that different, but Republicans, we're seeing some differences with the Democrats here. Now, what's interesting is when you turn to South Korea, and this is probably why the Americans are becoming less sure about exactly what this administration is doing with respect to South Korea, it's flipped, right? And thinking about US-ROK alliance, is it in US national interest? More Republicans think that it's in US national interest than it's not in US national interest than the Democrats. I find that interesting, even though you might say this is not meaningful, both supermajority, but that's a 6 percentage point difference. I think it means something, right? So here, I think it matters what country you're talking about when you're talking about alliance relationships. When it comes to USFK, again, Republicans want to maintain more so than the Democrats here. USFK's current troop presence, and perhaps even, in increasing, there's a marginal difference between Democrats and Republicans. But it seems to me that on Korea-related issues, Republicans are more supportive when it comes to alliances than other alliances around the world. Let's move on to the next slide, which looks at why this might be the case. Aside from the Republican strategic logic of this, it could be also that soft power has something to do with this, right? So you got on the left-hand side, this is a flower petal kind of plot, and the larger the petal, it corresponds to whatever that value is. And here, it's fairly clear that when you ask Americans whether or not South Korean culture has a positive influence on South Korea's image, 60% agree that it does. And you could take a look at this and compare it, cross-tabbed with overall favorability. That second question got cut off, but that question is asking, what do you find South Korea favorable? And that was the original question that well, I'm going to get to pretty soon. But when you take a look at the corresponding differences with perceptions of soft power, people who feel strongly about positive image of Korea due to Korea's culture also feel very strongly about the favorability, have favorable opinions of South Korea. Next slide is, where these people get this from. Obviously, food outpaces all the others, but fine arts, movies, and those are the close second, along with beauty products, about 15%. And then you got K-pop, fashion, TV dramas, a bit lower, but still very important factors there. Part of you take a look at part of the reason why Americans might favor relations with Korea more so than other countries might also have to do with how they look at trade relations with South Korea. And here, again, South Korea may not be as high in terms of the benefits about open trade. Japan, Canada, fairly high, along with the EU, recording up in the the low 30s to mid 30s. South Korea is in the next tier, about when you ask, whether or not trade should be increased at 25%, but you add that up with keeping it the same, this is about 70% support for trade with Korea, that they want to keep it and continue having that trade. And what's also interesting, when you compare this with China, China is different, right? So Americans are not favoring just open trade with everyone indiscriminately. It really depends on what these countries are and how they register in relation to other countries when they think about the value of trade relations with that country. You take a look also here, partisan differences on trade. What's interesting is that the partisan differences for these countries like South Korea are low, but where this is quite high, the partisan difference is high, is with respect to countries like China and Mexico. Maybe you could throw in Canada in there. That gap between the Republicans and the Democrats much larger for these countries than other countries. Again, when you think about communicating to the American public about the value of the trade relationship, I think it's very, very important to make that distinction, right? And how you communicate this to them, and whether it be directly on these issues or indirectly through soft power. We ask questions about tariffs, same kind of pattern, right? Overall, Americans don't like tariffs, but in some cases they do, right? China, clearly, they would like tariffs to be increased or kept the same. Yes, I mean, what's clear here is that they don't want it increased anymore across the board. Clearly for South Korea, they just do not want it to be increased. But whether they would like to keep it the same, a plurality would like to keep it the same or decrease it. Okay. Republicans consistently more supportive of raising tariff than Democrats, while Democrats are supportive of lowering tariffs. And if you look across the cases, the magnitude of that difference, or the magnitude by which they support tariffs or oppose tariffs, differs depending on the country. So the gap is largest on increasing tariff for China as opposed to other countries. Decreasing also, the gap is also larger there. So country by country basis, very important. That was my third point that I made about the macro trends. You ask about investments. On investments, it's very clear Americans do care where the investments come from, even though they support these investments. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking about general investments or you're talking about investments in the high-tech sector, right? Across the board, you see very favorable views about investments. But for China, it's an exception, right? The Chinese investments, people are somewhat more hesitant about supporting those kinds of investments into the United States. Again, partisan differences here as well, which we saw in our experimental survey earlier that we did together, Niels. I want to just run through generally. It's also, this is about East Asia and how people see East Asia very favorably. That's what this graph is telling you. If you want to read more about it, you can go and read about it in our report coming out. This, I think, is important because this issue has been getting some traction with the National Security Council's director saying that now, Korea is now negotiating on a new civil nuclear deal with the United States. And some people in Korea are suggesting that this is a potential gateway to nuclear latency. And what this is clearly telling us is that Americans will have none of it. Okay? They don't want it. It's not a popular thing. And so you've got a political issue when it comes to domestic politics about selling this to the American people. And it's an issue that I think needs to be addressed. In terms of defense industrial cooperation, because shipbuilding is so big now, this is another new set of questions that we added this year. And here, what's interesting is that when it comes to sharing, having defense cooperation with Korea or Japan on the right-hand side, very supportive, right? On defense cooperation on supply chains, yes, over 50% support that. But when it comes to sharing military equipment and technology or having technology transfers, they either think, 68% think you either want to make it stricter or keeping the same current level in. Now, this is a problem, right? Because when it comes to defense industrial cooperation, all of the regulations are related to this particular issue. How do you address this issue and be able to sell it from a national security standpoint, even though the Americans understand the value of this cooperation? You will have to thread a very careful needle between these two potential trade-offs. On North Korea, the simple message here is nothing's changed. People are somewhat, they're not supportive. It's not that, surprising. We had a bit of a change in 2021 after the administration switched over and failed Hanoi talks in 2019, but it's been fairly constant and consistent throughout. Okay. In terms of looking forward, so that was all looking back. Looking forward, what kind of issues do Americans want their government or the Trump administration to cooperate with when it comes to South Korea? And clearly the economic issues top the list, followed thereafter by security-related matters. And a lot of these other issues like human rights, global health, and climate change sort of taken a backseat compared to these other issues. And that's not just been this year, it's been fairly consistent throughout. So that's our methodology. And I took a bit too much time, so I'm sorry. Dina, but
okay, let's.
You got to press down. One minute.
Okay, great. So first of all, thank you, Scott. Thank you, James, for inviting me today. It's always an honor to be invited to speak here and join up our research with yours. James is a little speedier this year than we are. We haven't quite written up all of our 2025 data, so I'm going to give you some sneak previews into some of that, and then also rely on some of our research from last year, and I can comment on how things have shifted or not. But for the most part, I want to say our findings really corroborate each other's. We also find that Americans have a consistently favorable view of the United States, of South Korea as a trade and security partner. Find similar views on supporting American bases in South Korea, alliances in general, and valuing trade relations between the U.S. and South Korea. I thought I would step back and take a bigger picture view a little bit of what Americans think about international engagement overall, and then just kind of dive into some of the things that are a little bit different or a little interesting. First of all, this is from 2024. We saw that over the past few years, since 2021, really, there's been a steady decline in the percentage of Americans who think it's best for the United States to have an active role in world affairs. This question is sort of our overall barometer of internationalist views among the American public, and it actually goes all the way back to 1947. And all the way back to 1947, it was always between 6 in 10 and 7 in 10 Americans overall saying that we should play an active role in world affairs. But this steady decline has really happened sort of the Biden-Trump era. And in this particular, in 2024, it was a majority, slight majority of independents who said we should stay out of world affairs. And in 2023, a slight majority of Republicans said we should stay out of world affairs. And in 2025, it's gone up a little bit to about 6 in 10. And it's slight majorities and a strong majority among Democrats, but slight majorities overall. So we have a little bit of a shift up this time around, and some of that is because Republicans and some independents feel perhaps that with President Trump in office, they're more comfortable with taking an active role. And I will say, a lot of people point to this and say the percentage stay out means that Americans are isolationists. And we don't really find that at all. Americans, even if they say we should stay out of world affairs, it's usually because they want to focus on domestic problems at home, or they don't want us to be involved militarily, which we often are, especially when we were in the Iraq War and the troops in Afghanistan. So, and this most recent drop was related, we found, to decreasing support for U.S. military and economic assistance to Ukraine, and also probably related to U.S. assistance to Israel too. So the fact that we're involved even from afar, and these issues has been weighing heavily on Americans, especially when the dollar amounts floating around in terms of assistance aren't necessarily put into context of our overall spending, budget spending. So, whoops, I did it again, I'm so sorry. This is from 2025. Half of Americans say the United States has limited resources and its own domestic problems should reduce involvement in world affairs. And the other half say we have resources and we should play a leading role. You see that overall, Republicans and independents, by about a 5-4 margin, say we have limited resources, while Democrats are more open to international engagement and think we have enough resources to do both. This really goes back to what Republicans versus Democrats think the purpose of our foreign policy is. For Democrats, it's working with other countries and solving collective problems together. And for Republicans, they take a more traditionalist view of foreign policy, which is the primary purpose to protect the homeland and the physical security of the United States. So this sort of ties into some of those overall philosophies about what our foreign policy should do. And then this was just one, this particular slide I wanted to focus on because James found that Russia was the greater threat in his data, and we found that China, more so than Russia, is a critical threat to the United States. Part of this is possibly because our data was collected in July. I don't know if James, the KEI data, kind of tapped into some of the breaches that Russia has made with drones and aircraft into NATO airspace, or that might have been after, but it's just curious to me. But another reason why our numbers are a bit different here is because we included some domestic issues in with the foreign policy issues, and you see like US government corruption and weakening democracy in the United States takes a higher tier threat level than the other items. And like all of the external threats, Iran's nuclear program, development of China, North Korea's nuclear program, and Russia, they all are sort of in the middle somewhere. Okay. And I also think, let me just go back to this. I also think that it's interesting to think about threat in today's rhetoric because in a lot of ways, we've seen some softening on some other issues. And I think it's because some of our political leaders really focus on threats being internal rather than external, and that also plays into how some of these items are rated. Okay, so next, just wanted to say here, again, from a big picture level, Americans really do support alliances. They say 55% say that maintaining existing alliances is the very effective way to achieve U.S. foreign policy goals. It's higher than anything else on this list, including maintaining U.S. military superiority. Sometimes those flip, but right now alliances is seen as the more effective one, and that's probably because they're seen to be a little bit under threat by different demands being made upon our allies. And then this is just showing that U.S. support for alliances with East Asia is at an all-time high, 72%. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that China is perceived as a grave threat, especially for Republicans. So they really see the alliances in East Asia as being a bulwark against that. And then again, just to show you South Korea, Japan, Germany, Taiwan, they're all considered very good allies, and that the relationships are seen as beneficial to U.S. national security. Ukraine and Israel are highly partisan issues today and kind of reverse each other. They're mirror images. So Ukraine, we have seen big shifts that Republicans now are more supportive of helping Ukraine, but it's much more the Democrats that are really backing continued aid to Ukraine. And on Israel, it's really the Republicans who back continued support for Israel. Again, really just shows what James has shown, support our bases in Europe, support for defending allies in Asia. Support for defending our Asian allies, also pretty consistent with past years. For South Korea, it's a little bit lower now than it was, say, in 2021 or 2017. But that's because there haven't been a lot of media reports about North Korea doing missile tests or any threatening behavior lately. Just quickly wanted to go, because we can't really talk about South Korea without speaking about China when it comes to U.S. interests. Just like James found, international influence, U.S. still seen as the same, but China narrowing the gap. We saw a slight decline in 2024 on views of China's rise as a threat. Again, I think the administration has had more tempered rhetoric and is looking for a trade deal, so that sort of feeds into this. And then in 2024, we found that more Americans thought the U.S. should limit China's power rather than cooperate. And there's been some shifts on this as well in 2025, so stay tuned for that. And this was really surprising in 2024 and 2021 that U.S. trade with China weakens our U.S. national security, which ties in with your data as well, James. And then I just wanted to quickly show some polling that we did in China earlier this year. It's the first time we've been able to do a random, representative, statistical study of nationwide in China for years. And it's really interesting to compare it to American views too, in that 9 in 10 Chinese say their country should play an active part in world affairs. And as you recall, in 2024, only 56% of Americans said the same thing. And at its highest point, and since we've asked this question, 71% of Americans said we should take an active part in world affairs right after the September 11th attacks. So this is a high degree of confidence in their country's international status, and it crosses every demographic group. So this just shows how the Chinese, again, super confident. 97% say their country's in a strong position, 43% say very strong, and they feel that it will only grow stronger in the next 5 years, 95%, with 46% growing much stronger. And this was so Chinese opinion was really very consistent on measures of their country's status internationally and on the world stage. But here we saw some division about whether China should be the dominant leader or play a shared leadership role. And as we know, China has worked a lot in international institutions, and so they have some, I don't know if you'd call it a leadership role, but they have a role within international institutions, and but at the same time, 41% say that China should be the dominant leader. It's the younger Chinese and those with a higher level education that are more inclined to favor a shared leadership role than older and less educated who would prefer a dominant leadership role. And then this was just very interesting to see that from the Chinese eyes, Russia and North Korea are their really good friends. The South Korea, Japan, the United States are much lower down the list, especially Japan and the United States. And when we asked this question, something similar in Russia, we found exactly the same sort of blocks of countries coming together. And if you needed any kind of illustration of is there sort of a Cold War era type bloc system, these countries definitely see that. And then just the top two threats for the Chinese have to do with the United States, a possible conflict over Taiwan and economic competition. They're very aware of that as well. And so I'm going to just stop there and continue on with our discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you so much to both of you. Before I open it up for questions, I have one point that stood out to myself as well, and I think I want to bring up something that James mentioned about the sort of less clear definitions of who is a partner and who is a competitor or an adversary. So, and I think it's interesting in a time as well, like it's really across the board. And I think I saw even with Iran that it's even becoming less defined in a year where the U.S. has struck the nuclear program in Iran, and it's gathered a lot of attention. Dina, do you see anything similar in your data, if you have something on it, or do you have any sort of thoughts on the fact that James finds this sort of decline in how well defined partners and adversaries are?
I think first of all, I think it's hard for Americans to follow the shifting sands of news every day between domestic. There's so much going on domestically and internationally. But we saw in our data a couple years ago, we asked a 4-part version of ally, partner, rival, or competitor, and then adversary. And very few countries made the ally list. Like, I don't think any country got a majority. So saying that Americans, I don't want to say they're distrustful, but they have some of that self-interest in mind, I think, when you ask a question like that, because we are trade partners, we are security partners, but especially in trade, I think it can be seen as a more competitive space. But in general, when we ask about allies, Americans are very, very, very supportive and really seem to value, like I showed, they seem to value it as the most effective tool right now that we have, especially when it seems under threat a little bit now. So yeah, we have some nuances, but not quite to the same extent of reversals.
I think that's interesting as well, because I think it's largely consistent with what we had in that chart you displayed as well, James, of sort of what really shifted is sort of the perception of partners. I think mostly shifted sort of left in that chart, and I think that sort of goes back to your point as well, Dina, that it's sort of hard to make that cut of being perceived as a strong partner or ally, right?
Yeah, and I also think Americans, just think about the news we're getting. We have the ICE raids, we have National Guard in different cities, including our own, and so if there's a softening of views toward other countries, it might be because the focus right now is on what's happening here.
Yeah. Thank you. And with that, we have some time left for questions. I see, Scott, your hand is already up, and so we'll have some questions from the room. And if you're online, feel free to ask questions as well.
Yeah, James, I just want to ask you about one question that you did not talk about that I think is particularly interesting, and that is American attitudes toward the defense of South Korea versus the defense of Taiwan. And what do you think that says, especially in the context of the increasing focus on the potential of confrontation with China?
Yeah, I didn't have that in here, largely because it was in the second set of slides that I sent after this, which is why I think I lost and why there was an error in one of the slides. But if we were to, you're right, we did have that question. And in fact, we added that question last year, but we didn't include it in our annual survey, largely because I thought, number one, it was just too controversial, and we didn't have any other question like that in the past. Last year was the first time. In fact, some of these questions, like that one in particular, you, Scott, had a hand in that question. So it's good that you asked that question. And I should have talked about it. But thanks for asking. So we had that question last year, and we had that question this year. And the question is, if there is a dual contingency and Taiwan Strait and the Korean Peninsula, what would you do? What do you think the U.S. should do? Should it support both? Or should it help defend South Korea or Taiwan or neither, or don't know? And what's interesting is that when you ask it in those orders, both is obviously the plurality, 47% last year, 53% or 2% this year. Consistently last year and this year, low 20s, 24% last year, 20-something this year, say, if I had to choose, I'm going to choose Korea. And it's almost twice as high as it is for Taiwan. If we have to choose, there's more support for Korea than there is for Taiwan. It's interesting. I found that very interesting. We do have a mutual defense treaty agreement with the United States, so there are some, you could argue, treaty obligations attached to these reasons. What's also very interesting, that the don't know option is very low. People have an opinion about this, which I found very interesting as well. And this is a Korea-specific question, largely because the possibility of a dual contingency question is constantly coming up in Korea now, and it's one that the Koreans are very much aware of and interested in understanding. If the U.S. has to prioritize, which way would it go? And will it prioritize is another question, right? But clearly, what the data seems to show is that the Americans don't want to choose. Both are very important. That's the majority. And then, but among those that do want to choose, South Korea gets a slightly higher support for that as well. So I just found that also a very interesting question.
Can I ask a question about that? Did you ask about, so if South Korea is attacked by North Korea, or were they both by China, or just
Yeah, we didn't say.
Okay.
Essentially, if there's a military conflict in South Korea and military conflict in Taiwan, who would you help to defend?
Because I was going to say, in our data, we find the same, that a slight majority of Americans would defend South Korea if it is attacked by North Korea. And 42% around would support Taiwan if it's attacked by China. And I think the reason it's lower is because they do see Taiwan as an ally, is that Americans want to avoid a military conflict with China because they think China's, it's a formidable power, right? If they're thinking about North Korea being the aggressor against South Korea and that they would have to, I don't know that Americans would put it all together, that would mean China might get involved too, but just that they probably feel like it's a more, they'd have an easier time than against
less casualty, right?
Yeah.
And this is borne out by other studies that have been done in the past about whether they want U.S. to be involved in certain military conflicts, and it really depends on the cost.
Right.
And so, that could potentially be, I think, that's a very good explanation for this. But we didn't differentiate in our question, and so there could be bias built into this.
But they're similar either way.
Exactly. But what's also interesting, that's part of the reason why we held back on releasing this last year, because of the concerns about potential bias. And what we're seeing is that really hasn't changed much. So I find that quite interesting. But I think it's definitely plausible.
And then, of course, if it were really to happen, either one of these contingencies, then the messaging around it would take on a different type of influence on American public opinion. So usually when something becomes a live conflict, Americans will try to learn more about it, especially if the United States is involved, and then you might see views shifting.
I think so, and I think we could take that lesson away from Ukraine as an example, not just in the U.S. but elsewhere around the world. And I think it's also true when it comes to questions about Taiwan in South Korea. What would South Korea do in the event of a Taiwan contingency? And I don't think that's quite clear, but that our trilateral survey that we ran a month earlier, 75% support, over 50% support that Koreans would like to support that effort to defend Taiwan. 75% think that is quite likely in Korea as opposed to in the United States, about 42%.
Right.
So I just find that quite interesting also there, and how people think about some of these issues.
So one question over here, and if you don't mind presenting yourself for the audience quickly as well. I think we have a couple of minutes for a quick question here.
Hello, I'm Jordan. I'm Jordan Miranda. I'm a grad student at AU. I'm studying U.S. foreign policy. So thank you for releasing these very important graphs. I did want to ask, I saw on your second bullet point that Israel, which is, treaty bound to the U.S., is rated among the top foreign policy challenges and threats. And I wanted to ask, I guess, for clarification as to whether that includes Palestine, the ongoing conflict, or speculation as to why it was chosen among one of our biggest challenges. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question. So when you look here in terms of influence, you look. We didn't have this on the. Do we have this for the alliance relationship for Israel? Maybe we didn't. I don't know. I'll just go back to the chart that you were pointing to, which is this. And the way that I kind of took this was kind of look at it within the context of the Ukraine crisis, and you look at that trend on Russia in terms of relative influence. And it's just interesting to me that in both cases you have that increasing trend in terms of recognition of these two countries as an important country. And this wasn't the case in the past. When we take a look at the macro trend, it wasn't always that way. You look at Israel in 2020, it's ranked far below Russia, and then over time it's kind of, caught on. And a lot of that maybe shifts and switches have to do with what I suggested, which was changes in current events. And the longer the conflict goes, and this becomes a problem for our foreign policy and our national security, policy on national security, I think that it really registers on the radar for the Americans and say, this is a problem. But in terms of how they see that problem, we didn't really unpackage that. So all I could say is just reason from this that Americans today think that Israel is a very important challenge, important challenge compared to other countries. And they feel more so today than they did before. And it's interesting that it's correlated with sort of the length of the conflict and how long that's been ongoing. Same thing with Russia. I just found that to be quite interesting. And you could also see, interestingly, on the second greatest foreign policy on Ukraine, it's also trending up over time as well, the longer the conflict goes. So the longer these problems persist, Americans tend to think maybe this is a very difficult problem. Slowly begins to register. I just found that.
I would agree because it says challenge in the wording. I was going to say Republicans versus Democrats and independents, they view Israel in very different, given the ongoing conflict, in a very different lens. It wasn't always that way.
Which was your next set of slides.
Yeah, it's okay. But I think it's interesting on this slide that Russia is considered a challenge, but not Ukraine. So I'm guessing that because those two are seen as Russia and Israel are seen as the more powerful players, that they're the ones who would have to compromise to some extent. Good question, though. That's the thing with surveys, and I was an interviewer way back when in Detroit when I was in graduate school. If a respondent says, well, what do you mean by that question? You'll have to answer whatever it means to you. So we don't always know, like our question about you want to take an active part in world affairs, that can mean so many different things to so many different people, but it's just whatever's going on in the respondent's mindset that applies.
But if you're thinking about doing further research on something like this, that's a great research question to follow up on this data. Say, hey, we saw this, what does this mean? And ask more follow-up questions. And so I would encourage you to, do a bit more deep dive on that particular issue and with respect to Middle East and how Americans think about it. And there's other research that you've done. You have data on this as well, so that you might want to look into that and see if those survey studies get at the question that you're asking. But for us, in this survey, our focus on deep dive was on South Korea and the Korean Peninsula. But this is the sort of the macro trend, what I found just kind of interesting. This is the context within which Americans are thinking about the Korean Peninsula related issues. So that was the framing for our report. And clearly it doesn't answer your question, but it's just worth maybe following up on a bit more.
So thank you, Dina and James, for two excellent presentations, and thank you for sharing your insights with us. I believe with that it concludes our event, and so we thank everyone in the room and everyone online for joining us as well. Thank you very much.